needs to be on transforming our organizations and institutions to fit all people. And that's been our intent in the work we're doing. To truly move towards that racial equity, our institutional culture must prioritize humanity. People need the ability to work with the dignity of having their histories acknowledged and their lived experience valued. At UC Merced, we are striving to take up that charge. And to be clear, we are not done. This work is not final. This is a check-in for us to share with that. Nor do I expect that we will ever be. I say that because building and maintaining this racial equity culture is a daily practice, and it lives on in our commitment to ongoing learning and long-term transformation. I wanted to share just the final expert of Amanda Gorman, who now is a superstar and super famous, the National Poet Laureate and the youngest inaugural poet in history. And I quote from her, The Hill We Climb, which she shared at inauguration. We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover, and every known nook of our nation, and every corner called our country. Our people, diverse and beautiful, will emerge, battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light if we're brave enough to see it, if we're brave enough to be it. I'll add my own addendum to Amanda's wonderful poem, is that in the work of equity and justice, we're also brave enough to fight for that light for everyone. And so I want to quote Chancellor's message from yesterday from Black History Month, indicating that we remain committed to the ongoing task of learning, growing, and creating lasting change, and how we embody these values at UC Merced. And we will honor Black History Month this year, which frankly is every day, by working to uplift our Black and other represented voices and experiences that just strengthen our resolve to achieve a more just, inclusive, and equitable future for all members of our community. And this is part of our efforts to do just that. With that, I wanted to open it up to the other administrative co-leads of the Valuing Black Lives Task Force, Dr. Jonathan Grady and Dr. Robin DeLugan.
Thank you so much, Associate Chancellor Matos. I'm so excited to be here with you all today. As I think about today and our future, I must start with the recent words of the late Cicely Tyson, where she stated that I am not a quitter. I will fight until I drop. It is just a matter of having faith in the fact that as long as you are able to draw breath in the universe, you have a chance. We have a chance. Our country and our campus are in the midst of such unrest that at times we may be questioning the very fabric of who we are as a nation and as an institution. When we think about valuing Black lives, we must all recognize that this is all of our work. This is a commitment that we all must make. It's going to take all of us, not one office. So as we think about today's recommendations, we look forward to working with all of you to think about how do we move forward. We want your feedback. This is a fight for us all. And I hope that moving forward, that even in the most direst of moments, that we hold on to hope and lean upon one another. So thank you. Dr. DeLugan?
Thanks. So as chair of the Academic Senate, it's been my great privilege to be one of the administrative co-leads and Senate liaison for the Valuing Black Lives Task Force initiative. As it has been communicated, this is an effort that involves all of us, students, staff, faculty, and our community at large. There's a lot of work to be done. And so representing the Senate is been a real privilege. And I would just want to say that not only have we appointed Senate faculty to the 5 subcommittees that you'll hear about in today's presentation, but the Senate itself is also undertaking its own sort of reflection on the work that we do, our guiding documents, our bylaws, we've looked at Senate campus surveys, climate, faculty surveys, and we're trying to also get a bigger picture about where we as the Senate can have an influence. The Chancellor has been generous and has awarded some funds to the Senate for this purpose. We hope to align the recommendations of the Value in Black Lives Task Force with those particular areas that intersect with Senate faculty work or responsibilities in order to make a contribution to improving how we do things here at UC Merced. So it's a real privilege to be here, and I think you'll be excited about the update on the work that we've been doing for the past year. Thank you.
Thank you, Drs. Grady and DeLugan. It's been such an honor to co-lead with you. And I also want to acknowledge the executive sponsors of this task force, Chancellor Munoz and Provost Canfield. Before I turn it over to our amazing Office of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, Graduate Student Researcher, Hala Alnagar, for the presentation, I'd like to remind you that the chat is open for Q&A. So if you have questions that are ongoing throughout the presentation, feel free to include them there. If it's something that we can respond with a resource, we will send that link through. But if it's something that we need to answer live, we will do so at the end of the presentation, and we will certainly try to get to all of them. So with that, again, I thank you for being here. I thank you for being engaged in this work with us, and I turn it over to Hala.
Thank you, Dania. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Hala Alnagar, she, her, hers pronouns. I'm a graduate student researcher in the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And throughout the process of working with the Town Hall, I've helped with logistical support as well as background research. So I want to start us off with just kind of giving an overview of the way that the task force was structured. So as Dania mentioned, our task force sponsors are the Chancellor Juan Sanchez Munoz and the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost Greg Canfield. And then we have the task force co-leads, Associate Chancellor and Chief Diversity Officer Dania Matos, Associate Vice Chancellor and Dean of Students Jonathan Grady, and the Academic Senate Liaison Robin DeLugan, who were the ones that met directly with the subcommittees throughout the fall semester. And for our subcommittees, we have the 5 areas: student support, community engagement, policing and anti-Black violence, staff and faculty recruitment and retention, and research scholarship and funding opportunities. And so I want to give a quick overview here of what our kind of task force looked like, and shout out to our student intern in the EDI office for putting together this infographic. So quick overview, and I'll dive deeper into all of these numbers. Each subcommittee produced recommendations with the themes that are listed here. And just to give you kind of numbers of everyone that was involved, there were 46 meetings total across all of the subcommittees, 61 recommendations that were produced across all of the subcommittees, and 53 individuals involved. And we have faculty, both Senate and non-Senate, staff, administrators, alumni, students, both undergrad and graduate, and community members. And so when it came to actually selecting folks who were on the subcommittee, there were various methods for the selection process. So first and foremost, the priority was to ensure that the co-leads that were selected were representing all of our stakeholders: staff, Senate and non-Senate faculty, graduate and undergraduate students. And targeted nominations were sent to specific stakeholders whenever we saw that representation was low for specific subcommittees. And administrators were selected for each subcommittee based on their specific oversight, but also to ensure that each subcommittee had administrative support. And we also had various campus-wide announcements that went out to solicit interest. We sent requests for nominations to the Black Alliance at UC Merced. We also got student nominations from Pan-African Council, as well as various clubs, organizations, fraternities, and sororities. Senate faculty nominations primarily came through Academic Senate's Committee on Committees. Non-Senate faculty nominations came through the Non-Senate Academic Council. And then once we had a pretty decent number of subcommittee co-leads put together, we then encouraged them to recruit any additional members they felt would serve their needs, and particularly encouraged them to identify potential community members that they could work with. And so I'm not going to go through every single name, but I want to highlight the many folks who did this important work. And so I have here each subcommittee and the co-leads and members for each subcommittee, and to also demonstrate that we did our best to ensure that every stakeholder was represented. And so once the subcommittee co-leads were convened, we provided them with a list of guiding questions to guide them in their work and final goal. So we started them off with the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion strategic framework, which really kind of centers an equity and justice lens. And so we asked them, how are you advancing this strategic framework through the subcommittee with the particular focus of valuing Black lives? We also wanted them to identify what the campus currently does in the area. What are we missing in that area? How can we be anti-racist and work on combating anti-Blackness? And then we ultimately wanted them to produce immediate, midterm, and long-term goals, and also evaluate each of these goals. So how much will these goals cost? Are there specific units or campus actors that need to be involved in accomplishing these goals? What should we prioritize? So if we could only do 2 in a year, which would they be and why? And what are some of the most pressing issues? So there may be a long-term goal that you have, but because of the current climate of addressing anti-Blackness, then maybe that's a goal that needs to be prioritized. And so I want to give an overview of our timeline. So the charge letter from Chancellor Munoz and Provost Canfield went out in July 2020, and that's when we began the process of populating the subcommittees. In August 2020, we had the first meeting between the task force co-leads and the subcommittee co-leads, and this is where we provided them with an outline of the time commitment and the goal expectations. In October 2020, we had a progress check-in with all the committees, and we created a space for collaboration across all the subcommittees. So this was a meeting where all of the subcommittee co-leads came together to provide updates on their work thus far. It gave us an opportunity to give them feedback, and it most importantly provided a space for these subcommittees to interact, as this work does tend to be intersectional. And in November 2020, the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion published a petition responses executive summary. And within this document, we wanted to really outline the various demands that had been made by our campus community and the responses that the campus has started thus far. And in December 2020, the subcommittees presented their final reports, recommendations, and goals to the Chancellor and Provost. And in December was the first time that we sent an email out for the tracking survey. And the tracking survey is something that we produced in our office, essentially to track the initiatives and to maintain the sense of accountability. So we identified with each initiative and response which unit or cabinet member was responsible. And so this survey was then sent out to them to kind of keep track of the process on that initiative. And this survey is then sent out every month so that we're keeping track of the progress and that these things kind of don't get forgotten. And then our plan is early February to produce an executive summary from the task force co-leads with the recommendations that are informed by each of the subcommittees' work. And so I want to emphasize here that our goal for this presentation is really to provide an update, but our work, as Dania said, is not done. It will never be done. But specifically for this task force, we're still in the process of finalizing that summary. And we'd like to also use this session as an opportunity to gain feedback from the campus community and ensure that your feedback is incorporated into that final report before we can then begin the implementation phase. So I have here kind of the work scope and general numbers of recommendations for each subcommittee. So you can see that each of them kind of had themes and areas that were very specific to their subcommittee. And it was really up to them to come up with the themes that seemed relevant to their work. And some of them might have taken a different approach. So if you take a look at staff and faculty, they had to separate their recommendations by staff and by faculty, since recruitment and retention methods might be different for each of those groups. And I'll get deeper into the recommendations and provide examples of each. So many of them had many recommendations, so we can't get through every single recommendation in our session today, but I'd like to just pull a few that I feel represented each of the themes that I listed. So for student support recommendations, some of their themes, we have campus culture. So one recommendation that they had that was short-term was to update staff job descriptions to include responsibility for equity, inclusion, and social justice. When it came to classroom climate, a short-term goal that they recommended was to incorporate anti-racist pedagogy into teaching assistant and graduate orientation week training starting in fall 2021. For Black student mental health, a long-term goal was to hire a position within CAPS that coordinates equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts within the mental health systems framework. For the Black Scholar Resource and Retention Center, a long-term goal would be to expand the current space allocation that we have and create sustained funding to support the operation of the Black Scholar Resource and Retention Center. And when it came to leadership, scholarship, and career, a short-term goal was to potentially host an alumni series on bringing your whole identity to the workplace as part of a career readiness series that we would then continue. And so for community engagement recommendations, they had 3 themes: education, research, and outreach. So an example of one of their education recommendations was a short-term goal to engage with the Merced Black Parallel School Board to better understand the needs of students. In the area of research, a long-term goal was to begin establishing a process for the collection of data on community engagement activities, from research to courses, student activities to service/volunteering by staff, etc., to facilitate stronger connections and streamline some of these community engagement activities. And for outreach, an example of a short-term goal was to offer transportation to university events from the south side of Merced. And this is part of a larger conversation on engaging in better rhetoric around south side of Merced, as it tends to be racialized and classed. And so for the policing and anti-Black violence recommendations, they had the themes of communication, accountability, and training. So an example of their recommendation with communication was an intermediate term goal of establishing regular reminders. Each term, we would send out a video and information sheet that clarifies the expectations for community police interactions and how to address breaches of those expectations. For accountability, a short-term goal was to shift the complaint investigation out of the UC Merced Police Department to the appropriate office where any community member would feel safe to raise concerns and be confident that those concerns will be heard. And a recommendation for training is intermediate, which is to create a training module for faculty and staff that reinforce the regular reminders that were mentioned, and also build on existing anti-bias, anti-racist, and context sensitivity training that UC Merced Police Department staff undergo. And then we also have the staff and faculty recruitment and retention recommendations. So some of an example for their branding and sourcing for talent recommendation. So for staff specifically, they recommended that we add successful candidate language to include, and they provided an example paragraph here. The successful candidate will demonstrate a history of cultivating a diverse, equitable, and inclusive work environment that will support the advancement of UC Merced's commitment to creating and maintaining a positive environment that promotes and develops others from a variety of personal experiences, values, and worldviews that arise from differences of culture and circumstance. An example recommendation they have for selecting talent is that all interview guides and scoring rubrics must be approved by the assigned recruiter prior to interview scheduling. And equity, diversity, and inclusion and talent acquisition interview question library can provide a bank of interview questions that focus specifically on EDI behaviors. And a recommendation for onboarding and socialization. So they first outlined that organizational socialization is the process by which new employees become acclimated to the culture of a new work environment. And they provided a number of examples, such as sharing the principles of community with new team members, a welcome team luncheon, suggesting a half dozen recommendations for one-on-one coffee breaks, accompanying new hires to meet collaborators and other important partners, and many others. And lastly, they had ongoing retention, development, and engagement. And so one of the suggestions they had is to distribute up-to-date and historical demographic information by department and school to the campus community so that we're constantly tapped into the demographic information of our campus. And lastly, we have the Research, Scholarship, and Funding Opportunities Subcommittee, and they had 2 themes of community conversations as well as professional development. So I provided a few examples here. So one of the midterm goals that they suggested was convening a community conversation series wherein we would invite community partners and academics to create a list of big ideas for racial equality in education and outreach. A long-term goal is to host a national conference at UC Merced, which focuses specifically on valuing Black lives and research and scholarships around that area. And a recommendation for professional development is a long-term goal wherein we would establish a center for racial justice with the following mission: to deconstruct racism in our schools and communities by increasing access to racial scholarship, research and training programs, and empowering our educators, students, and community partners to rebuild their spaces for a more racially equitable world. And so I want to now shift into where we're currently at in the process, which is developing this Valuing Black Lives initiative that would first and foremost take all of the recommendations that I listed, plus many more that weren't listed, and begin an implementation phase on the recommendations that are of the most priority. And so we have 3 themes here. And so when we think about the Black community on our campus, we want to ensure that we're cultivating an environment where we encourage Black success. We also want to create an environment in which our Black community can continue to thrive. And so how do we take that success and maintain it? And to bolster the Black excellence that already does exist on our campus. And so I have on the sides here 2 recommendations that the task force co-leads came up with. And these 2 recommendations are really specifically centered around this implementation phase that would begin shortly hereafter. And so the first recommendation is to really create some type of structural oversight of the implementation of the task force recommendations. And so we are thinking about potentially an oversight committee. And so one of the things that we see is that there are many initiatives that take place on our campus. These initiatives are very disparate, and there isn't really one area where you see all of these initiatives centralized. And so creating an oversight committee would not only hold us accountable to ensuring that we push forward the recommendations that have been brought forward, but to also centralize the many efforts that are happening on our campus, and in that way also improve the efficacy of those efforts, because you kind of have one place where you can find information on that, and all of these different folks can come together. And so within creating that structural oversight, we also recommend developing a strategic plan for the implementation of these initiatives and strengthening the use of the tracking survey that I mentioned. And so this tracking survey is still relatively new, but ensuring that we are consistently developing the metrics that we use to measure the success of these initiatives. And I also want to highlight that many of the subcommittees that did a lot of this work, they were consistently engaging with the campus community. They were holding sessions to get information from folks on what the priorities are of our campus. And so we want to ensure that that's how the work continues, and that these decisions are made starting from our campus and then up, and listening to the needs of the campus community. And we do have an activity coming up, but before we move to the activity, I want to turn it back over to the task force co-leads, Dr. Grady and Dr. DeLugan, who have a little bit of information on some of the steps that our campus already has taken that are currently in progress.
Yeah, so as we think about students and some of the work that different campus stakeholders that we've already been doing, I want to turn to a few examples. Our Counseling and Psychological Services Office, led by Dr. Tania Gonzalez, just recently did an assessment of Black mental health and wellness for our Black community, and partnered with a nonprofit organization, Black Girls Doctor Network, to really assess what are the mental health and wellness needs of our Black students and staff and faculty. And we'll continue to use that data to construct new initiatives. So that work is ongoing. In addition to that, we did launch our first Black Research Fellowship for students, staff, and faculty. We have 4 awardees that are all doing work around racial justice, around Black liberation. They will present to the campus community at our first Black Research Symposium in May this year. And that is funded fully by the Chancellor's office this year. So that's another thing that we've been working on. In student affairs, for example, We've been doing a lot of work around diversity mapping, really thinking about goal setting for equity, justice, and inclusion within every unit, and really thinking about how do we set intentional goals and how do we then assess progress and how are we holding folks accountable for this work. So those are just a few things that we've been working on. We continue to meet with myself and Dr. Neese, our Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs. We continue to meet with our Pan-African Council every month and that's made up of 7 or 8 Black clubs and organizations on campus to really hear the ongoing needs of our Black scholars and working with them to think about ways to, to better meet their needs and ways to continue to look at racial justice. And lastly, I'll just mention the work that is being done in our leadership, careers, and service office. They put on last semester a wonderful Black leadership conference led by the work of Jess Evora. And that was fantastic. We received a lot of positive feedback. So we continue to thrive and to continue to support our Black scholars each and every day. Dr. DeLugan?
Yeah, so just to amplify a little bit my initial comments about the Senate action plan that sort of goes side by side with this Valuing Black Lives initiative, I think it is important to recognize some of the work that is happening now, and some of it is ongoing. Some of our faculty scholars have been terrific leaders in this effort to bring attention to the Black experience on campus, or whether it's faculty, students, or staff. And so I want to do a shout out to them for their enduring work. Also, the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning has had a very popular anti-racist pedagogy working group going on, and I think it perhaps can be a model for future work to how to support our faculty to incorporate anti-racist teaching. And then lastly, I would just say that campus is involved with strategic planning, including faculty involved with academic planning. And one of the criteria there for our campus is a diversity category. So in addition to excellence in research and excellence in teaching, we as faculty, we know that diversity is one of our highest goals. And so figuring out ways to do our planning, our future planning, and our future vision that makes diversity concerns front and central, I think is another important thing to acknowledge about ongoing work. Thank you.
Thank you both. I know I just shared in the chat a site where we are centralizing all the information to include the transparency and accountability. We are moving at a pace faster than we can get the information out to you. So if you ever doubt, please feel free to go there, and we're happy to do that. We will also upload the presentation. And so to just expand on Dr. DeLugan, the anti-racist pedagogy was a partnership between the Office of Equity, Diversity, Inclusion and the Center for Engaged Teaching and Learning. Highly successful. We are now going to be doing an equity advancing showcase on it, where we're going to invite proposals and create a full day of curriculum development around inclusive pedagogy, right? So not only what are you learning in the classroom, how does it feel to be in the classroom, but how can we continue to equip you to be transformative practitioners engagement. We are also looking to expand professional development opportunities for our staff of color. And so those are some initiatives that we're doing through the Inclusive Excellence Institute. That's going to be a partnership between my office and the Vice Provost for Academic Personnel, as well as expanding all those efforts. There are a lot to name, and I want to get to the activities, so feel free to read more about that. I think it's really important to think about, right, there's all the programming that my office is doing around the virtual dialogue series, and we are going soon to be launching Dialogues That Matter, which Hala is also a part of, but there's also the structural policy pieces that we're working on and looking to evaluate. In partnership with institutional research, we are in the process of developing a dashboard with them so that you can easily go and quantify all of the data related to this. So you can see funding allocated, but also all the different initiatives and the disaggregation of bringing racial equity to also our data and our research as an institution. And so the working group that Dr. DeLugan named, reading the chat, is the Anti-Racist Pedagogy Group, I believe, Dr. DeLugan. Is that the work group you were citing?
It could be that, or in general, the Senate is involved with an action plan, the Senate itself, and there are some subcommittees within that. So that could be it, could be what she's referring to.
Great, and I think this is a good opportunity to also share that our Valuing Black Lives Task Force was a direct and response to the anti-Black violence we saw and kind of witnessed heightened during this summer. It is going to be used to catapult and launch our Valuing Black Lives initiatives, which is going to be our ongoing commitment. So just because the work of the task force ended in 2020, this is going to be the framework that's going to create that sustained work ongoing that I shared in the opening recommendations. And so we are soliciting your feedback as part of our community before Drs. DeLugan and Grady and I submit our report of how this work should move forward to the Chancellor and Provost. And so they have not made any decisions on sort of what's going to do or not, but we knew it was really, really important to provide a framework for this to thrive. And we've identified these 3 areas to do so. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Hala.
Awesome, thank you. So like Dania said, this work is ongoing, and this work it's necessary within this work to ensure that all voices are heard and represented, and that decisions are not being made for our campus or not being made on behalf of our campus community, but being made informed by their needs. And so we're going to move into an activity where we solicit your feedback, and specifically so that we can incorporate this feedback on what we eventually do recommend to the Chancellor and Provost, and in terms of the implementation plan. And so I'm going to have Associate Chancellor Matos put a Google Doc link into the chat. And within this Google Doc link, you're going to see a table. If you've been in some of our other work group town halls, we've done an activity similar to this. And so we're going to take a few minutes for each question. And at the top, you're going to see question 1, which is, what are some strengths of the processes that were outlined in this presentation regarding the way the task force was convened, its goals and timeline? What are some potential areas of improvement? And so if you could type your responses on the left-hand side of the table, and if you see that folks are already writing something that you agree with, you can instead put a plus sign on the right-hand side of the table. So if we can start with question 1, and I'll give folks about 5 minutes to fill that out. So I'm seeing some folks that are having trouble because there might be too many people in the document. If you are having trouble, I will leave this link up for the next day or two. That also applies. I saw some comments about people that maybe had come in late and missed some of the presentation. So this link will remain available at least for the next couple of days so that you can come in and put in your feedback. And I'll also make sure to have the link sent out to folks so that you have access to it. And so we'll give folks about another minute for the first question before we move on to the second. All right, so if you can scroll down to the second question, the second table, and this question asks, in thinking about the various subcommittees and example recommendations that were presented, and again, emphasizing that not all of the recommendations were presented here, but what are some areas that you feel are a priority when it comes to valuing Black lives on our campus? Give folks about another minute to wrap up their thoughts. Again, as a reminder, this will be available for the next day or two if you're not able to complete it now. All right, so thank you all for filling that out. Again, apologies for not ensuring that everyone had access to it. We've never done it with this many people, so we'll definitely try to figure out methods to ensure that everyone can do it in the moment. But for now, I'll ensure that this link, the Google Doc link, is sent out to everyone who was in attendance so that you can provide your feedback within the next couple of days before we then go in and analyze the data. So I'll go ahead and now move on to our question portion. And I know that we've had a few questions that were already answered in the chat, but if you have any additional questions, you can submit them in the Q&A box, and our task force co-leads will be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Hala, for your work, not only on this, but in helping the task force keep the work moving. We had some pre-submitted questions that I will address, and I also tried to address as many as possible on the chat as they were coming in. One of the first that was also in the chat and pre-submitted was whether or not the recommendations will be available to the campus community to read. Yes, we will be making the kind of presentations available via box folder. We wanted to do the town hall first, and then we will share it on the diversity website and ensure that that is included in a follow-up email so you all can see. I also want to be clear that those are the recommendations. Nothing has been finalized yet. We wanted to engage with you all and solicit your feedback. Are there ones that resonate more for you? Are there ones that in your role in respective areas you see more of a need for? So I think that's critically important for us to do. And so I'll open it to my co-leads and even you, Hala, because you are an integral part of this work. But one of the questions has been, what can we do to hold our campus leaders, AVCs, supervisors, and each other accountable to true commitment to the recommendations?
I can begin. I think that the tracking dashboard is going to be essential. So really thinking about how are we ensuring that the community is, one, aware of the priorities and the initiatives, and then also aware of where things are at in the moment, and the ability for feedback, the ability for questions to be posed. So I think that that's one way to really think about accountability, and also intentionality around who's doing what, who's leading what, by when, those questions. So I think that is embedded in the tracking dashboard that Hala mentioned earlier. I think something else that is going to be important is for the campus to think about how we are holding everyone accountable, for valuing Black lives. It's not just the Valuing Black Lives Task Force. It's not just the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. It is the work of all of us. And I think being intentional about that through an ED&I strategic plan, where it really maps out what we're doing well. And I know that faculty, staff, students, our community, we are doing some amazing things already to value Black lives. But what are those things, right? And then in thinking about where are the gaps, where are the challenges, what challenges are we facing? I think that has to really be mapped out, and it has to be clear to our community so that we are able to hold not only administration accountable, but hold ourselves accountable as well.
Thank you, Dr. Grady. I think I'll expand upon that. So some of the ideas and recommendations that I'm thinking of as our administrative co-leads and have already started working on with institutional research is what I spoke to before about how do we bring this racial equity to the data, right? So tracking the transformation in our institutional culture can be multiple ways. We can look at staff engagement and faculty and students, postdocs, our community based on satisfaction, tenure, but the disaggregation of that data is really critically important. So how are we disaggregating that data based on role, race, where we can really truly see where there are disparities? I think perception's reality for folks. And so really having the data to back that up to then address it. Also having annual competencies so we can actually gauge our collective understanding of race and how it impacts our work. Some questions we can ask is, how well faculty and staff are equipped to identify and address interpersonal, institutional, and structural racism at UC Merced. How often are we taking risks to engage in these dialogues that matter? how much do we support conversations about racial equity internally? So having those kinds of questions and framework and engaging in that equity action planning is part of what my intent is to do for us. And then having our performance reviews really hold folks accountable. That's an area where I know the core competency is quite subjective and pretty open. And so really working with HR and sort of the faculty side of the house as well to create tangible measures of progress beyond the institution. I want to be really clear that putting in the institutional supports does not preclude your department or your administrative unit to create goals that expand beyond that and create your own measures. I've been so sort of heartened to see that happening already in some spaces and places, but really having that embedded into the thread of all of us, right? And so that's why I see those institutional mechanisms being really important to engage the folks that might not know how or are not doing so quite yet, but also to amplify and empower the folks that are. And so part of the summits is for me to bring together the folks that are doing this and having them share out and having you all engage with each other to spark the ideas of how we can do this better. Dr. DeLugan, did you have any?
No, I'm just in awe of both Jonathan Grady and Dania Matos. I mean, in some ways, you know, they are true experts in guiding us through this. I would just say like one example that the monitoring of how we're doing. We had a subgroup of the Senate look at some recent campus surveys of climate and or faculty, how they're doing on campus. We only have a handful of surveys that have been done, and most of them have not been consistently with consistent language or consistent measurement. And so we have some recommendations. They haven't, this is, even the Senate hasn't seen these recommendations yet. But for example, sometimes we're asking about, you know, discrimination, or how do you feel about that sort of questions of more directly belonging, where we really are trying to disaggregate, but we really need to know about the full experience, the full campus experience, right? So sure, we want to know where there are problems in that area of feeling, you know, not belonging or discriminated against, but there's also the whole campus experience that needs to also be examined by looking at it through intersectional, you know, filters to know how particular groups, in this case, Black faculty, students, staff, are doing on campus. I think we can do better at that. And the other thing we've noticed is we're not always sure. We you know, now that we have Dania Matos and her wonderful EDI office and build that's helping us really look at this with fresh eyes and fresh energy. Knowing who is responsible. So it's one thing to gather data, and it's one thing to monitor from one year to next year. But when you see there's problems that are already surfacing in these, who's then taking the action, or what is the action? I'm not 100% sure that in the past, we've had a really clear idea of how then to act on action when we get it in a kind of a, you know, survey or kind of research oriented framework. So I'm just very confident that moving forward, we all realize this isn't the ending of this work. It's not the beginning, and it's certainly not the ending. And that through these kind of conversations and dialogue and sharing with all of you, you all have some expertise to contribute to this problem and problem solving and goal setting, that our campus will continue to just excel and improve in this area. We're strong in some areas, and we can be stronger still in others.
Thank you, Dr. DeLugan. I wanted to answer some questions that have come in live. One of them being, why can't we require every vice chancellor and senior leader cabinet members to release a statement of commitment to diversity? I think it's an excellent idea and something we've already discussed and working on. Under Chancellor's leadership, cabinet has already been engaged in anti-racism, critical race theory development, having our first session in January. But I think it's also important beyond the commitment and the words that come out, it's what are the actual steps that cabinet members and the vice chancellors are doing. And that's something that we're all collectively committed to and doing ongoing. And so happy to share more on that, but, you know, excellent point. One other question that came in is, how are we defining and measuring Black excellence, Black success, and Black thriving? And so that's part of kind of the themes and the categories of the Valuing Black Lives Initiatives launch. I'll open it up to my colleagues, including you, Hala. Feel free.
And I'll just add, Dania, to the question about commitment to diversity statements, and letting you all know that we do have divisions that are already working on this. Our Division of Student Affairs, for example, has charged every unit within the division to write a commitment to diversity statement, a commitment to equity, justice, and inclusion, and a commitment to valuing Black lives. And not only that, really thinking about, as Dania mentioned, the accountability piece, the goal setting, and how are we going to hold ourselves and others accountable. I'll share in the chat box an example from our Counseling and Psychological Services unit that has already posted their commitment to diversity statement. Also, I know that our UCM PD has also done some work around their commitment to racial justice, to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they will be working on posting their commitments as well. So just to note that units and divisions are already working on commitments to diversity, and I think that that's a great idea.
Thank you, Dr. Grady. And so to the question of success, thriving, and excellence, I think it's part of the components that we all talked about. When we share all the recommendations, you will see that they emerge under one or more of those categories. If there's others you'd like to see, certainly let us know. Part of the tracking survey is to measure just that. One, that the work is getting done. Two, that it is done in a way that really honors the humanity and dignity. And so when I think about thriving, right, I think of the components of the whole person, right? And that when we talk about bringing your full self to work, it is something that is honored and valued, be it through mental health, be it through performance, be it through the opportunities that you're afforded, be it through not being kind of exposed to trauma and the like. And so really having that holistic framework is really, really important in thinking about how we value Black lives. Hala, I don't know if there's anything more specific from the recommendations that you want to expand on.
Yeah, I guess what I would add is, like, in thinking about those themes, and those three categories are really to help us and how do we categorize the recommendations. And I think similar to what Dania said, for me, when I think about those three categories, it's almost this timeline, right, of thinking, and similar to the guiding questions that I provided for each subcommittee. And we have Black excellence that absolutely does exist on our campus. And so how do we then take what we have and ensure that, that our campus community is successful, how we ensure that the Black community on our campus can succeed with the excellence that they already have. And then moving from that, how do we then ensure that the Black community thrives, that the success is not momentary, but that it's continued, and that we have something built into our institution to ensure that they have the support to succeed and continue to thrive with that success. I think similar to what was already touched on, we oftentimes see that there is a reaction to a movement, and then there comes a lull where we forget about it, and then it comes back again. And I think it's important that this is not a movement that ebbs and flows. It has to be continuous. It has to be ongoing. It cannot be something that we let fall to the side until there's another death in the community. It's something that needs to be constant on our brains and a constant conversation that we have, and really integrated into every initiative that we see on campus. If we have an initiative here, where do the Black lives on our campus fit into that initiative? And so I think with those three themes, it's for me, when I've thought about those three categories, it's ensuring that the work is constant and ongoing.
Thank you, Hala. So we have one more question that came in the chat, and I'll read it as is. I believe it is very important and necessary goal to have all new hires draft a written commitment to Black lives. But what about long ago hired middle management and senior leadership whose lack of commitment, or worse, aversion to supporting Black lives had already taken such a toll on the institution? I think as part of the commitment, it also includes folks that are already here and not just for new folks. So I think that's a really good recommendations in terms of hiring beyond our contributions to diversity statement, but really thinking about how we're valuing that. But what about the folks that are here, right? And we cannot just make that an expectation of requirements of those who are oncoming, but as part of our commitment here, it certainly is something that we we can look at implementing for folks here and engaging. As Dr. Grady shared, Student Affairs is already engaging in those pieces, but thinking about how that can translate to all the other different groups is really important. Any other questions or final thoughts? I wanted to amplify also in the chat that folks have wanted to get involved. This is always an open call. You can always email diversity@ucmerced.edu. Our campus communications solicited just that as well. And we often ask, so if you want to get engaged in this work in any way, there is going to be an implementation phase. And I do see an implementation team or some sort of body coming at that has not been constituted. And so you are really, really interested. Please feel free to email us. I want to thank you for being with us. I want to thank you for helping us value Black lives. I want to thank you for being who you are and for what you do. And I'll turn it over to my colleagues to also share any final reflections.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for your commitment. And I look forward to working with all of you to move this work forward.
I just want to thank you all also. I know that being online in this webinar format it has its pros and cons. It's not quite the same thing as being in the room together and really being able to share active conversation. But hopefully soon, maybe by fall, we'll get closer to these in-person opportunities to share information in a more intimate fashion. I just want to thank my co-leads, Hala, for a great presentation and all the good work she's doing behind the scenes to help us piece all of this information together and move forward. And so thank you again for joining us for this important conversation.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day. I know there's some questions we didn't get to in the chat, so I will get you a direct response. And if not, share that out widely so that it benefits us all. Thank you again.